What would you do if you saw a mother and her child thrown into the snow like garbage? Most of us would drive by, maybe feel bad for a moment, then forget. But sometimes, one split-second decision changes everything. Sometimes, helping a stranger reveals the very thing you thought you'd lost forever. This is the story of Luke Anderson, a man who had everything money could buy, but nothing his heart truly needed. And Emily Ross, a woman who lost everything, except the one thing that mattered most. Their paths crossed on the coldest day of winter, in a moment that would warm both their hearts for a lifetime. You're about to witness how one act of unconditional kindness can heal wounds you never knew you carried, and how the universe has a way of bringing the right people together at exactly the right time. The December wind cut through the suburbs of Denver like a blade, but inside his luxury sedan, Luke Anderson felt nothing. At 40, he had built an empire from the ashes of his own failures. His company, Anderson Tech Solutions, employed over 300 people. His mansion in Cherry Hills Village could house 20 families. His bank account had more zeros than most people could count. But as Luke pulled into his circular driveway staring at the massive empty windows of his home, he felt like the poorest man alive. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that took Sarah away. 3 years of raising their daughter Emma alone, watching her smile fade a little more each day. 3 years of success that felt hollow, achievements that rang empty in rooms too big for the love they once held. Emma, now 10, greeted him at the door with the same polite smile she gave everyone. Distant, careful, like she was afraid to feel too much. "How was your day, Dad?" "Good, sweetheart. How was school?" The same conversation. Every day. Like actors in a play they'd performed 1,000 times. Luke watched his daughter disappear upstairs to her room, and the silence swallowed him whole. He had everything a man could want, and nothing a heart could need. He was surviving, not living. Existing, not thriving. The business meeting earlier that day had been another victory. A multi-million-dollar contract signed, handshakes all around, congratulations from his team. But driving home, Luke couldn't shake the feeling that he was just going through the motions of a life, not actually living one. The next afternoon, Luke drove through the winding roads of his affluent neighborhood, his mind occupying the familiar territory of quarterly projections and strategic planning, when something made him slow down. Ahead, outside one of the grandest mansions on Belmont Street, a house he'd always admired for its old-world elegance and perfectly manicured gardens, a commotion was unfolding that made his blood run cold. A young woman, maybe late 20s with dark hair escaping from a messy ponytail, was on her hands and knees in the snow, frantically gathering scattered belongings from burst suitcases, children's clothes, books, a small stuffed elephant, family photos, the intimate debris of a life suddenly uprooted. Beside her, a small boy who couldn't be more than 6 stood frozen in his winter coat, his little arms wrapped around himself, tears streaming down his cheeks as he watched his world literally scattered in the snow. Standing in the ornate doorway of the mansion were an older couple, both impeccably dressed in the kind of expensive clothing that announced wealth and status. The woman's face was twisted with disgust, her mouth a thin line of judgment and cruelty. The man's arms were crossed in cold judgment, his posture radiating the kind of authority that came from never having been questioned, never having been denied. Their voices carried across the winter air like shards of ice, cutting and merciless. "You have no right to be here anymore," the older woman spat, her voice carrying the kind of venom that could only come from someone who'd never known real hardship, real desperation. "Thomas is gone. You're nothing to this family now. You never were anything to this family. Please." The young mother's voice cracked, raw with desperation and exhaustion. "Just until I can find somewhere to go. Just a few more days. Jake's been through so much already." "Absolutely not. You've taken enough from us." The older man stepped forward, his expensive shoes pristine against the marble threshold. "Security will escort you off the property if you're not gone in 5 minutes, and don't think about coming back. We've changed the locks and we've instructed our attorney to pursue trespassing charges If you set foot on this property again. Luke watched, transfixed by the cruelty unfolding before him, as the small boy tugged on his mother's coat with mittened hands. Mommy, why are they being mean to us? Why can't we go inside where it's warm? The mother's face crumpled as she pulled her son close, her body shielding him from both the wind and the vicious words still pouring from the doorway. I don't know, baby. I don't know. That's when Luke saw it, in the child's confused eyes, in the mother's trembling hands as she tried to gather their scattered belongings while protecting her son, in the way they clung to each other against a world that had suddenly turned cold and cruel. He saw himself 15 years ago, when his first business had failed spectacularly, when the bank had foreclosed on his tiny apartment, when he'd stood on a street corner with nothing but a suitcase, full of dreams and a heart full of broken promises. He remembered the feeling of being utterly alone, completely abandoned, with nowhere to turn and no one who cared whether he lived or died. But more than that, he saw something that awakened every protective instinct he'd buried along with his wife. He saw innocence being crushed, kindness being punished, love being dismissed as worthless. And for the first time in 3 years, Luke Anderson felt something crack open in his chest. Not pain, but purpose. Without thinking, without calculating the risks or considering the complications, Luke pulled over. His heart pounded as he got out of the car, the December air hitting him like a wake-up call, sharp and clarifying and utterly real. He approached, slowly, his expensive suit stark against the domestic chaos unfolding before him, his polished shoes crunching through snow that was already beginning to soak through the scattered belongings. The older couple noticed him first, their conversation, halting as they took in his obvious wealth and authority. "Can we help you?" the man asked, his tone shifting to the kind of false politeness reserved for people who might be important, might be influential, might be worth impressing. Luke ignored them completely. He walked straight to the mother and child, kneeling down, to their level in the snow without regard for his expensive clothing. Up close he could see the exhaustion etched in the young woman's face, the way her hands shook not just from cold, but from shock and grief. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been pushed beyond her limits, who was running on nothing but love for her child, and the desperate hope that somehow, somewhere, someone might show them kindness. The woman looked up at him with eyes full of fear and exhaustion, instinctively pulling her son closer, her body language screaming both desperate hope and practiced wariness. She'd clearly learned not to trust easily, not to expect help, not to believe that strangers might care about her well-being. "I'm Luke," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in years, rusty from disuse but somehow finding the right tone. "I live just down the road. Do you and your son have somewhere warm to go tonight?" The mother shook her head, unable to speak through the tears that were freezing on her cheeks. Her whole body was trembling now, whether from cold or shock or the simple relief of having someone speak to her with basic human decency. Luke couldn't tell. Luke glanced at the little boy who was studying him with curious, intelligent eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Something in the child's gaze reminded him of Emma at that age. Before the accident, before the walls went up, when she still believed the world was fundamentally good and that adults could be trusted to protect the people they loved. "Would you like to come stay at my place for a while?" Luke heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deeper than thought, from the part of him that remembered what it felt like to be rescued when all hope was lost. "Just until you figure things out? I have plenty of room, and it's warm, and I think we might have some hot chocolate that needs drinking." The older woman from the mansion stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Excuse me, but who are you to interfere in family matters? This is a private situation that doesn't concern you." Luke stood slowly, his full height and presence suddenly commanding, the authority he'd learned in boardrooms and business negotiations settling around him like armor. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet power of a man who had built empires and faced down hostile takeovers and never backed down from a fight that mattered. "I'm someone who believes in helping people who need it. I'm someone who doesn't think children should be left in the snow because adults can't remember how to be human." He turned back to the mother and child, his voice softening again. "What's your name?" "Emily," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Emily Ross. This is my son, Jake." "Well, Emily and Jake," Luke said, offering his hand to help Emily to her feet. "Would you like to get out of the cold? My car is warm and my house has fireplaces and guest rooms and probably some clothes that would fit better than what you're wearing right now." Behind him, he could hear the older couple sputtering protests, making threats about lawyers and property rights and family business. But Luke had made his decision, and nothing they could say would change his mind. For the first time in 3 years, he was acting on pure instinct, pure compassion, pure human decency, and it felt like coming back to life. What would you do in Luke's position? Have you ever had a moment where you had to choose between walking away or stepping up? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage change everything. Luke's guest house sat on the back corner of his property, connected to the main house by a stone pathway that wound through gardens that would be beautiful in spring, but now lay dormant under snow. The cottage was a cozy 2-bedroom structure that had been empty since his mother-in-law moved to assisted living, a space that had been designed for family, for connection, for the kind of multi-generational living that his own life had become, too fragmented to accommodate. As he showed Emily and Jake around, Luke watched the little boy's eyes grow wide with wonder at details Luke had long stopped noticing. The built-in bookshelves filled with children's stories, the window seat overlooking the garden, the way the hardwood floors creaked in a homey, welcoming way that his marble-floored mansion never did. "There's a fireplace," Jake exclaimed, the first spark of joy Luke had seen in him, his small voice echoing in the space with the kind of excitement that only children could muster even in the midst of trauma. "That's right." Luke smiled, kneeling down and feeling something, rusty and unused, stirring in his chest, the instinct to comfort a child, to create safety and warmth and possibility. "Would you like me to start a fire? I think there's still some wood stacked outside, and I seem to remember there being marshmallows in the kitchen cabinet." Emily sat on the edge of the couch, still clutching her purse like a lifeline, her body held rigid with the kind of tension that came from having your world ripped apart and not knowing where the next blow might come from. "Mr. Anderson, I don't know how to thank you, but I should explain. We're not charity cases. I mean, we are right now, obviously, but I don't usually." She trailed off, struggling to find words that would preserve some shred of dignity in a situation that had stripped away every defense she'd ever built. "You don't owe me any explanations," Luke said gently, his hands busy with kindling and newspaper, the familiar rhythm of building a fire bringing back memories of family camping trips and cozy winter evenings when his house had been full of laughter instead of silence. "Tonight, just rest. Just be warm and safe and fed. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next, but tonight doesn't need to be about anything except getting you both settled." As the flames began to dance in the fireplace, casting warm light across the room and chasing away the chill that seemed to have settled in Emily's bones, Jake crept closer to the warmth. His eyes, which had been wide with fear and confusion, began to soften as he watched the fire catch and grow. "Mister," Jake said, his voice small but brave, "are you a good guy or a bad guy?" The question hit Luke like a punch to the chest, so direct and honest and necessary that it took his breath away. In a child's world, this was the most important question. Not how much money someone had, not what kind of car they drove or house they lived in, but whether they were safe, whether they could be trusted, whether they would hurt or help. Emma appeared in the doorway just then, drawn by the voices and the unfamiliar presence of other people in their usually quiet world. Luke had texted her to come meet their guests, but seeing her now, hesitant, curious, a little defensive, he realized how long it had been since their home had welcomed strangers, since their lives had included anyone outside their careful bubble of polite distance. "Dad?" Emma said, her voice carrying all the questions she was too well trained to ask directly. "Emma, I'd like you to meet Jake and his mom, Emily. They're going to stay with us for a little while." Luke watched his daughter's face, looking for signs of resentment or resistance, but finding instead something he hadn't seen in years: genuine interest. The spark of curiosity that had been buried under layers of grief and learned emotional caution. Luke watched something magical happen then, something that reminded him that children were often wiser and braver than adults. Emma, who had been withdrawn and careful for 3 years, looked at Jake and saw not an intrusion or a complication, but someone smaller than herself who needed protection and friendship. Some instinct kicked in, the same instinct that had made her help injured birds and comfort crying classmates, and she walked over to him with the kind of natural grace that adults spent years trying to reclaim. "Do you want to see my room?" she asked Jake, her voice carrying the first genuine warmth Luke had heard from her in months. "I have video games, and I think there might be some leftover pizza in the kitchen if you're hungry." Jake looked at his mother, who nodded through fresh tears. But these were different tears. Not the desperate tears of abandonment and fear, but grateful tears, overwhelmed tears, the kind of tears that came when kindness appeared just when you'd begun to believe it no longer existed in the world. Later that evening, after the children had fallen asleep watching movies, Emily finally told Luke her story. They sat in his kitchen, steam rising from mugs of coffee, the house quiet around them. "My husband Thomas died 2 months ago," she began, her voice steady but hollow. "Car accident. We were married for 8 years, together since college. He came from money, old Denver money, the Ross family." Luke nodded, not interrupting. "I never fit in with them. I was a part-time literature teacher, grew up in a trailer, park in Colorado Springs. To them, I was the girl who trapped their golden boy." Emily's hands trembled slightly around her mug. "But Thomas loved me, and that was enough." "What happened after the accident?" Emily's face darkened. "Everything changed overnight. Suddenly I wasn't family anymore. I was a burden. They said Thomas never made a will, which I knew wasn't true, but I couldn't prove it. They gave me 2 months to grieve and figure out my next steps. Today was my deadline." Luke felt anger building in his chest. "They threw you out with a 6-year-old child. They said Jake would be better off in boarding school, that I was too unstable to raise him properly." Emily's voice broke. "They wanted to take my son from me, Luke. My son." The pain in her voice was so raw, so familiar. Luke remembered the months after Sarah's death when well-meaning relatives suggested Emma might be better off with family who had more time, more stability. The audacity of people thinking they knew what was best for your child. What kind of man was Thomas? Luke asked gently. For the first time that evening, Emily smiled. Kind. Generous. He always said he wanted to use his family's money to help people, not just make more money. He invested in small businesses, helped startups get off the ground. He believed in people. Something flickered in Luke's memory, but he couldn't quite grasp it. The next morning brought crisp sunshine and the sound of children's laughter, a sound Luke's house hadn't heard in years. He found Emma and Jake building a snowman in the backyard, Emma patiently showing Jake how to roll the snow into perfect spheres. "She's good with him," Emily said, appearing beside Luke with 2 cups of coffee. She needed this, Luke realized aloud. Taking care of someone else. It's bringing her back to life. They watched in comfortable silence until Emily spoke again. "I need to find work. I can't stay here indefinitely living off your charity." Luke turned to study her face. What if it wasn't charity? What if it was employment? "What do you mean?" "My assistant just gave notice. She's moving back east to care for her mother. I need someone organized, intelligent, good with people. The pay would cover an apartment in a good school district for Jake." Emily stared at him. "You don't know anything about my qualifications. I know you raised a kind, intelligent child, while dealing with people who made your life hell. I know you kept your family together through grief and loss. I know you protected your son even when you had nothing left to protect him with." Luke met her eyes. "Those are the qualifications that matter." "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Luke watched Emma help Jake place stones for the snowman's buttons. Because someone once helped me when I had nothing, and because helping you is helping me remember who I used to be. 3 weeks later, Emily had transformed Luke's chaotic professional life into organized efficiency with the kind of grace that made impossible tasks look effortless. She had an intuitive understanding of people that made clients feel heard and valued, remembered details that impressed investors, and anticipated needs before Luke even recognized them himself. More than that, she brought warmth back into spaces that had been cold and sterile for too long. The Anderson Tech Solutions office, once a temple to efficiency and productivity, began to feel like a place where human beings actually worked and laughed and connected with each other. Emily remembered birthdays, asked about employees' families, brought in flowers for the reception desk, and somehow made everyone feel like they mattered as individuals, not just as cogs in the corporate machine. "Mrs. Ross," said Janet, Luke's head of marketing, cornering Emily by the coffee machine one afternoon. "That presentation you helped organize for the Portland client was absolutely brilliant. The way you structured the emotional appeal alongside the financial projections, the way you wove their company's mission into our technical capabilities. Where did you learn to do that?" Emily smiled, the kind of smile that came from being recognized for her abilities rather than just her circumstances. "Teaching literature for 8 years. You learn how to make people care about stories, even when they think they don't want to hear them. You learn how to find the human connection in everything, how to make abstract concepts feel personal and important." Luke overheard this conversation from his office and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Pride in someone else's success. Not just professional satisfaction at having made a good hiring decision, but personal joy in watching Emily discover her own strength, her own value, her own potential. Watching her bloom under appreciation and respect was like watching a flower turn toward sunlight after too long in shadow. At home, the changes were even more profound. Emma had a constant companion in Jake, and the house filled with the sounds of childhood again. Not just the polite, careful sounds of one well-behaved child trying not to disturb the adult world, but the messy, joyful chaos of two kids who felt safe enough to be loud, to laugh, to argue about video games and trading cards and whose turn it was to choose the movie. Luke found himself lingering at dinner, drawn into conversations about school projects and playground politics and the elaborate fantasy worlds the children created together. Emma would explain the rules of some complicated game she'd invented, Jake would add his own modifications, and Luke would find himself genuinely engaged in discussions about dragon habitats and superhero weaknesses and the best strategies for building blanket forts. "Dad?" Emma said one evening as they cleaned up dishes, her voice casual but her words carrying weight. "I'm glad they're staying with us." "Yeah? Why's that?" Luke asked, genuinely curious about his daughter's perspective on the changes in their household. Emma considered this seriously, the way she approached all important questions. "Jake makes everything more fun. He asks good questions and he's not afraid to be silly. And his mom makes really good pancakes and she knows all the words to songs I like." She paused, then added the thing that made Luke's chest tighten with emotion. "But mostly you smile more now, you laugh at stuff, you seem like you're actually happy to be here instead of just going through the motions." Out of the mouths of babes, Luke thought, realizing that his 10-year-old daughter had been carrying the burden of his grief and emotional absence, had been watching him just survive instead of live, and had been wise enough to recognize the change when it came. One night, Luke was working late in his home office, trying to catch up on emails and quarterly reports, when he heard Emily's voice drifting from Jake's room. She was reading him a bedtime story, her voice soft and melodic in the quiet house, rising and falling with the rhythm of narrative that spoke of years of practice, years of this sacred nightly ritual. But it wasn't the story that stopped Luke in his tracks as he passed by the doorway. It was the conversation that followed, the kind of honest, heart-deep talk that only happened in the safety of bedtime routines, when the day's defenses were down and truth could emerge in whispers. "Mommy?" Jake's young voice asked, barely audible, but carrying the weight of questions he'd been storing up. Are you sad that Daddy died? Luke froze in the hallway, torn between walking away to give them privacy and staying to make sure they were okay, to be available if either of them needed him. Yes, baby, Emily answered with the kind of honest directness that honored a child's need for truth. I'm very sad that Daddy died. I miss him every single day. I miss his laugh and his hugs and the way he used to make funny voices when he read you stories. Me too. I miss how he used to carry me on his shoulders and how he knew all about dinosaurs. Jake's voice was small, but clear. But I'm glad we don't live with Grandma and Grandpa Ross anymore. Luke heard Emily take a shaky breath. Why, sweetheart? Because they were mean. They said mean things about you when they thought I wasn't listening, and they never smiled at me the way Daddy used to. Their house was big, but it felt cold, and they never wanted to play games or read stories or do anything fun. Jake paused, then added with the devastating honesty of childhood, Daddy wouldn't want us to live with people who are mean to his family. What do you think Daddy would want for us? Emily asked gently, and Luke could hear her trying to navigate between honoring Thomas's memory and helping Jake process their new reality. Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Luke could almost hear him thinking, working through concepts that were too big for his young mind, but that his heart understood perfectly. I think he'd want us to be happy, and I think he'd want us to be safe, and I think he'd want us to be with people who are nice to us and who make us feel like we belong somewhere. What do you think about Mr. Luke and Emma? Emily asked, her voice careful and loving. I think Mr. Luke is sad too, but he tries to be happy for Emma, just like you try to be happy for me. And I think maybe sad people should stick together so they can help each other remember how to be happy again. Jake's voice was getting sleepy, but his words carried the kind of wisdom that sometimes emerged from innocence. Emma told me her mom died, and that's why Mr. Luke gets quiet sometimes. But he's not as quiet when we're here. Luke felt his chest tighten with emotion that he'd been holding back for weeks, maybe years. Jake, Emily said softly, you know Mr. Luke and Emma aren't our real family, right? We're just staying here until we find our own place. I know, Jake said, and Luke could hear him settling deeper into his blankets. But they feel like family. Doesn't Mr. Luke feel like family to you, Mommy? Doesn't this feel like home? There was a long pause, and when Emily answered, her voice was barely a whisper, but Luke heard every word. Yeah, baby. They do feel like family. This does feel like home. Luke stood in his hallway, his heart pounding, as something cracked open inside, him that had been sealed shut for 3 years. For the first time since Sarah's death, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to be part of a family again, to have people who belonged to him and to whom he belonged, to have a house that was full of love instead of just expensive furniture. The conversation drifted into sleepy goodnight murmurs, and Luke retreated to his office, but he couldn't concentrate on work. Instead, he found himself staring out the window at the snow-covered garden, thinking about chosen families and second chances, and the way healing sometimes crept up on you when you weren't paying attention. Saturday morning found Luke in his home office, finally tackling the filing project he'd been avoiding for months. Emily had offered to help organize his old investment documents, and they worked together in comfortable silence, sorting through years of financial history. These angel investment files go back a decade, Emily commented, lifting a thick folder. You've helped a lot of startups get off the ground. I try to invest in people, not just ideas, Luke replied, not looking up from his own stack of papers. Someone took a chance on me once when I had nothing but a dream and a lot of debt. I try to pay that forward. Emily opened the folder and began organizing the documents by date. That's exactly what Thomas used to say. He believed in investing in people's potential, not just their business plans. Luke glanced up, that familiar flicker of recognition tugging at his memory again. Actually, Emily continued, he had this one investment he was particularly proud of. Some tech startup in Denver that was about to go under. The founder was brilliant but had made some mistakes, and everyone else had written him off. Thomas saw something others didn't and invested $500,000 when no one else would. Luke's hands stilled on the papers. He never told me the name of the company, Emily said, flipping through documents. But he always said it was the best investment he ever made, not because of the financial return, but because... She stopped mid-sentence. Luke looked up to see Emily staring at a photograph paper-clipped to an investment agreement. Her face had gone completely white. Emily, what is it? With trembling hands, she held up the photo. It showed two men shaking hands in front of a small office building. One was clearly a younger Luke Anderson. The other... That's Thomas. Emily whispered. That's my husband. Luke's world tilted on its axis. He crossed to Emily in two quick strides, taking the document from her shaking hands. There it was, in black and white. Anderson Tech Solutions, initial investment agreement, Thomas Ross, $500,000. This can't be, Luke breathed. But even as he said it, the memory was flooding back. 7 years ago, when his company was hemorrhaging money and creditors were circling like vultures, when every bank had turned him down, every investor had walked away, when he was 3 days from bankruptcy and considering giving up on everything he'd worked for. Then Thomas Ross had walked into his dingy office above a sandwich shop, looked at Luke's business plan and said, I believe in what you're trying to build here. The Ross Foundation, Luke said suddenly. That's how he invested, through his family's foundation. Emily fumbled for her purse with shaking hands, pulling out her wallet. From inside, she withdrew a small photograph, her wedding picture. Thomas Ross smiled back at them, his arm around a radiant young Emily in a simple white dress. He saved my company, Luke said, his voice hollow with shock. If Thomas hadn't invested that money when he did, Anderson Tech Solutions would have died before it ever really lived. Everything I have, everything I've built, it's because of your husband. Emily stared at the investment document. He never told me. I knew he made investments, but he never mentioned specific companies. He said he didn't want me to worry about the business side of his life. He came to check on the company twice after that, Luke remembered. Just quiet visits, asking how things were going, if I needed any advice. He was so proud when we landed our first major contract. Luke's voice broke. I wanted to invite him to our celebration dinner, but he said he preferred to stay in the background. Said seeing good people succeed was reward enough. The room fell silent except for the sound of Emily's quiet tears. All this time, she whispered, I thought you were just being kind to strangers. But we're not strangers, are we? Thomas connected us 7 years ago and neither of us knew it. Luke stood and began pacing, his mind racing through implications and connections that were reshaping everything he understood about the past 7 years. Emily, there's more. So much more. The Ross Foundation. I've been trying to track down the administrators for months to make a donation. A substantial donation. I wanted to give back, to honor the investment that changed my life, but every lead I followed went cold. That's because the foundation was dissolved after Thomas died, Emily said quietly, her voice heavy with the bitterness of opportunities lost and dreams abandoned. His parents shut it down immediately. They said it was hemorrhaging money on frivolous charitable causes and that they needed to streamline the family's financial obligations. Frivolous charitable causes, Luke repeated, anger building in his voice like a storm gathering strength. Emily, do you have any idea what your husband's investment in my company has returned? What his frivolous belief in a desperate entrepreneur has grown into? Emily looked up sharply, seeing something in Luke's face that made her own eyes widen. What do you mean? Luke pulled out his phone and began scrolling through financial documents, his voice gaining strength as he found the numbers he was looking for. The original investment of $500,000 is now worth approximately $2.8 million. And that's just the direct return. The indirect value, the jobs created, the problem solved, the other investments that became possible, because of Thomas's initial belief, that's incalculable. Emily's hand flew to her mouth. 2.8 million? Conservative estimate. And growing every quarter. Luke turned to face her fully. Emily, do you understand what this means? Jake isn't just some displaced child whose grandparents don't want him. He's the son of Thomas Ross, Heir to a man who helped create something meaningful, something lasting. He's not a burden or a charity case, he's the rightful inheritor of his father's legacy. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but these were different tears. Not the hopeless tears of abandonment, but the overwhelmed tears of someone learning that the story she'd been told about her worth, her son's worth, her family's place in the world was entirely wrong. His parents told me Jake had no legal claim to anything, she said, her voice shaking with anger that was finally finding its target. They said since Thomas died without updating his will after Jake was born, and since we were never officially divorced from his family's financial trust. They lied, Luke said flatly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had navigated complex business law for years. Even without a specific will, Jake is Thomas's biological son. He has rights they can't just ignore or wish away, but more than that, Emily. The Ross Foundation, all of Thomas's private investments, the returns on the money he used to help people like me. That's Jake's inheritance. That's his father's real legacy. Luke began pulling files from his cabinet, his movements quick and decisive. I have documentation of every conversation Thomas and I had about his investment philosophy. I have records of his expressed wishes for how his money should be used. I have proof that he intended his wealth to continue helping people, to keep creating opportunities for entrepreneurs and dreamers and people who just needed someone to believe in them. I don't understand business, law, Emily said helplessly, her voice small in the face of legal complexities that seemed insurmountable. I wouldn't even know where to start, how to prove any of this. Luke knelt beside her chair, his voice gentle but filled with determination. I do understand it. And I have lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of situation. Corporate lawyers, estate lawyers, people who know how to fight wealthy families who think they can rewrite reality to suit their preferences. His voice grew firm with resolve. Emily, your in-laws didn't just kick you out in the cold. They stole from your son. They tried to erase his father's legacy and leave him with nothing so they could maintain control over assets that legally and morally belonged to Jake. But why would they do that? Emily asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Control, Luke said grimly. With Thomas gone and you out of the picture, they control all the Ross family assets. They can dissolve foundations, redirect investments, make sure the money stays in the family business instead of going to help other people. But if Jake has a legal claim, if the courts recognize his right to his father's estate, then they lose that control. They have to honor Thomas's wishes, continue his work, share power with a 6-year-old boy and his unsuitable mother. Emily stood abruptly, walking to the window that looked out over the snow-covered garden where their children were playing, building snow forts and throwing snowballs with the kind of careless joy that only came from feeling completely safe and loved. I don't want to fight them, Luke, she said quietly. I just want to raise my son in peace. I want him to grow up knowing he's loved and valued, not feeling like he's the center of some legal battle between adults who can't remember what really matters. And you should be able to do that, Luke said, moving to stand beside her. But Jake deserves to know who his father really was. He deserves to inherit not just money, but Thomas's dream of helping others. He deserves to grow up with the knowledge that his father was a man who made the world better, who believed in people, who used his advantages to create opportunities for others. Luke's voice softened. And Emily, you deserve to know that Thomas's investment in me wasn't just about business. It was about values, about the kind of world he wanted to help create. Every job my company has created, every problem we've solved, every other entrepreneur I've been able to help because Thomas helped me first. That's all part of Jake's inheritance too. Have you ever discovered a connection that changed everything? You thought you knew about your life. Sometimes the universe works in the most mysterious and beautiful ways, bringing people together across time and circumstance. 3 days later, Luke sat across from Margaret and William Ross in their opulent living room, the same living room where they had coldly dismissed Emily and Jake just a month earlier. But this time, Luke had backup. His lawyer, Sarah Chen, sat beside him with a briefcase full of documents. Mr. Anderson, William Ross said stiffly, we're not sure why you've requested this meeting. Our family's private affairs are none of your concern. Actually, Luke replied calmly, they are very much my concern. Your son Thomas was one of my business partners. Margaret's face tightened. Thomas made many investments. That doesn't make you family. You're right, Luke agreed. But it does make me someone who understood Thomas's values, someone who knew what he stood for. Luke leaned forward. Tell me, do you know the current value of Thomas's investment in Anderson Tech Solutions? Older couple exchanged glances. We're not privy to the specific details of Thomas's business dealings, William said carefully. Sarah Chen opened her briefcase. Then let me enlighten you. The original investment of $500,000 is now worth approximately $2.3 million. That investment, along with Thomas's other private holdings, should legally belong to his heir, his son, Jake. Margaret's composure cracked. That child has no legal standing. Thomas died without updating his will. Actually, Sarah continued smoothly, Colorado state law is very clear about inheritance rights of biological children, regardless of will status. Jake Ross has a legal claim to his father's estate that no family member can override. Luke watched. The blood drained from William's face. What are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Luke said. I'm stating facts. You've stolen from a 6-year-old child. You've denied him his inheritance and lied to his mother about his rights. That woman is a gold digger who— That woman, Luke interrupted, his voice dangerous, is raising Thomas's son with more grace and dignity than either of you have shown in your entire lives. She's working 2 jobs to support her child because you threw them out in the snow. Margaret stood abruptly. We don't have to listen to this. Actually, you do, Sarah said calmly, because in 3 days we're filing suit for Jake's inheritance. All of it, including the Ross Foundation assets you dissolved illegally. Luke stood as well. Thomas saved my company when no one else would. He believed in helping people who had nothing. The least I can do is make sure his son gets what his father intended him to have. You can't prove Thomas intended anything for that boy, William sputtered. Luke smiled coldly. Can I? I have 7 years of correspondence with Thomas about his investment philosophy. I have records of every conversation we had about using success to help others. I have documentation of his charitable giving patterns and his expressed wishes for his money to go to worthy causes. He leaned closer. But most importantly, I have something you apparently never had. I understood your son. Thomas would be ashamed of what you've done to his family. The room fell silent except for Margaret's labored breathing. What do you want? She finally asked. Justice, Luke replied. Jake gets his inheritance, Emily gets an apology, and you stay out of their lives unless you're invited back in. And if we refuse? Sarah Chen smiled. Then this becomes a very public court case about how one of Denver's most prominent families stole from a grieving widow and her young son. I doubt that's the kind of publicity the Ross name needs. Luke watched Thomas's parents realize they had lost. In trying to control everything, they had lost the only things that truly mattered: their family, their legacy, and their son's respect. As they left the Ross mansion, Luke felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of fighting for someone who couldn't fight for themselves. Just like Thomas had done for him 7 years ago, the circle was complete, but the story was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Luke found Emily in his kitchen, sitting at the table that had become the heart of their improvised family, staring at legal documents spread across the surface like a treasure map to a future she'd never dared to imagine. Jake was at school. Emma was at a friend's house, and the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating papers that would change a little boy's life forever. I can't believe this is real, Emily whispered, her fingers tracing the court order that officially recognized Jake's inheritance rights, the legal language that transformed him from a displaced refugee into the rightful heir to his father's legacy. Luke sat beside her, close enough to smell her shampoo and feel the warmth radiating from her skin, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. Tears of relief and vindication, and overwhelming gratitude. Believe it. Jake is now the rightful heir to Thomas's complete estate, including the reconstituted Ross Foundation assets. When he turns 18, he'll have enough money to fund his own charitable foundation if he wants to continue his father's work. The money isn't what matters, Emily said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I mean, it's wonderful that Jake will have security and opportunities, but that's not the important part. The important part is knowing that Thomas's parents can't hurt him anymore. They can't claim he doesn't belong or that he doesn't deserve his father's love. They can't try to take him away from me or make him feel like he's worth less than their approval. Luke reached over and covered her hand with his, feeling the tremor in her fingers as she processed this complete reversal of everything she'd been told about her worth, her son's worth, their place in the world. What did they say when your lawyer called them with the settlement terms? Emily's laugh held no humor, but it was stronger than the broken sounds she'd made weeks ago. Margaret actually apologized. Can you believe that? After everything they put us through, after throwing us out in the snow and trying to steal Jake's inheritance, she apologized and said they may have acted hastily in their grief. Hastily, Luke repeated, his voice flat with disgust. I told her that Jake would always love his grandparents if they chose to be part of his life in a healthy way, if they could learn to respect his mother and honor his father's memory, but that I would never let them make him feel small or unwanted ever again. Emily's voice grew stronger as she spoke. I told her that love isn't about control or conditions or social status. It's about acceptance and support and helping each other become the best versions of ourselves. Luke studied her face, marveling at the transformation he'd witnessed over the past 2 months. Emily had evolved from the broken woman he'd found in the snow into someone strong, confident, unafraid, not because her circumstances had improved, but because she'd remembered who she was underneath the grief and fear. You've changed, he said, meaning it as the highest compliment he could offer. So have you, she replied, meeting his eyes with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she saw him clearly. All of him, the successful businessman and the grieving widower and the man who was learning to live again. We both have. That evening, Luke found himself on his back porch, watching Emma and Jake play in the yard as spring began to assert itself over winter. The air was warm enough for the children to shed their heavy coats, and Luke could see the first green shoots pushing through the snow in his flower beds. Everything felt like it was coming back to life, including parts of himself he'd thought were gone forever. Emily joined him, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual, settling onto the porch swing beside him with the kind of comfortable intimacy that spoke of familiarity, of belonging, of home. They sat in companionable silence, both lost in thought, both processing the enormity of everything that had changed in their lives over the past 2 months. Luke, Emily said finally, her voice careful but determined. You know I can afford my own place now, right? The inheritance settlement included immediate financial support for Jake's care and education. I could put a down payment on a house in a good neighborhood, get us established somewhere we could build our own life. Luke's chest tightened with the fear he'd been carrying for days. The fear that success might mean losing the family he'd accidentally found. I know. And you know I'm grateful for everything you've done for us. You've given us our lives back, our dignity, our future. You fought for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. You've shown Jake what it means to be a good man, and you've shown me that there are still people in the world who choose kindness over convenience. Emily, Luke began, but she held up her hand. Let me finish, she said gently, her voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that had sustained her through everything. You saved us, you fought for us. You gave Jake back his father's legacy and gave me back my sense of worth. I could never repay what you've done, and I don't want you to think I'm ungrateful or taking any of this for granted. Luke turned to look at her, seeing something in her expression that made his heart skip. Not gratitude or obligation, but something deeper, something that looked like love. Is this your way of saying goodbye? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily smiled, And in that smile, Luke saw everything he'd been afraid to hope for. Actually, it's my way of saying that for the first time in months, I'm staying somewhere because I want to, not because I have to. It's my way of saying that I have choices now, real choices, and the choice I want to make is to build a life with you. What are you saying? I'm saying that Jake thinks of you as his dad, that he lights up when you come home from work and asks for you when he's scared or excited or needs advice about anything important. I'm saying that Emma has become the sister Jake never had, that she's protective and loving and patient with him in ways that make my heart hurt with gratitude. Emily took a breath, her voice growing stronger. And I'm saying that I love you, not because you saved us, not because you're Jake's hero, not because you've given us security and stability, but because you're kind and genuine and you make me want to be brave again. Because you've shown me what partnership looks like, what it means to have someone who sees your worth even when you can't see it yourself. Luke reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. I love you too. I have for weeks, maybe from that first night when I watched you read Jake a bedtime story and realized I was listening to the sound of home. I just didn't know if you could ever see me as more than the man who helped you when you needed it. You're so much more than that, Emily whispered, her eyes bright with tears that were pure joy. You're the man who chose to stop when everyone else would have driven by. You're the man who saw value in people others had thrown away. You're the man who fought for justice when it would have been easier to mind your own business. You're the man my husband would have wanted in our lives. Love often comes when we're not looking for it, when we're focused on healing and growing and becoming the people we're meant to be. What unexpected moments have brought love into your life? 6 months later, Luke stood in his backyard watching the most beautiful chaos he'd ever seen. Emma's 12th birthday party was in full swing, and the yard was filled with children's laughter, the smell of barbecue, and the warmth of chosen family. The garden had exploded into full spring bloom and everything felt vibrant and alive and full of possibility. Jake ran up to him, grass stains on his knees and joy radiating from every inch of his small body. Mr. Luke, Emma said you have a surprise. For me. Luke knelt down to Jake's level, marveling at how much the boy had grown and changed over the past months. The frightened, confused child he'd first met in the snow had been replaced by a confident, happy kid who knew he was loved and valued and safe. I do, buddy. But it's not just for you, it's for both of you and for your mom too. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, but instead of the ring Jake might have expected, it contained an antique pocket watch, its gold surface worn smooth by years of handling and use. This belonged to your dad, Luke said softly, his voice carrying the weight of memory and honor and connection across time. He was wearing it the day he invested in my company, the day he saved my business and changed my life. It was in his personal effects that the lawyers returned to your mom after the settlement. Jake's eyes went wide with wonder and reverence. My dad's watch? Your dad's watch? Your inheritance isn't just money, Jake. It's the knowledge that your father was a man who helped people, who believed in dreams, who used his success to make the world better. Luke's voice grew gentle. And someday, when you're older, I hope you'll carry this watch and remember that your father's real legacy isn't what he owned, but what he gave, what he built, what he made possible for others. Jake held the watch like it was made of the most precious material in the universe, his small fingers tracing the intricate engravings with the kind of reverence children reserved for truly sacred objects. Mr. Luke, Jake said, looking up with those serious eyes that seemed too old for his young face, are you going to marry my mom? Luke glanced across the yard where Emily was laughing with some of the other parents, her face bright with happiness and confidence, her whole body language speaking of someone who had found her place in the world and was comfortable in her own skin. Would that be okay with you? Luke asked, genuinely wanting Jake's blessing, understanding that this decision affected all of them. Jake considered this with the gravity that children brought to questions that mattered. I think my dad would like you. I think he'd want Mom to be happy, and you make her happy. Plus, Emma told me that if you marry Mom, then we'd really be brother and sister for real. And that would be the best thing ever. Is that what you want? Jake threw his arms around Luke's neck with the fierce, uncomplicated love that only children could offer. I already think of you as my dad. The paper stuff doesn't matter. What matters is that you love us and we love you and we take care of each other. Luke felt his throat tighten with emotion that was pure joy, pure gratitude, pure love. I love you too, Jake. More than I ever thought possible. As the sun set over Denver, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose and purple that seemed too beautiful to be real, Luke found Emily sitting on the porch swing, watching their children play together in the fading light. The laughter and chatter of the birthday party had died down, the guests had gone home, and they were left with the quiet intimacy of family, of belonging, of home. "Good party," she said as he sat beside her, the swing creaking gently under their combined weight. "The best," he agreed, taking her hand and marveling at how right it felt, how natural, how much like coming home after a long journey. "Emily, there's something I want to ask you." She turned to look at him, and in her eyes he saw the woman who had fought for her son in the snow, the woman who had built a new life from nothing, the woman who had learned to trust again after betrayal. But he also saw something new: peace, contentment, love without fear or reservation. "Ask me," she said softly, her voice carrying absolute trust and openness. Luke reached into his other pocket and pulled out a simple ring, elegant in its simplicity, chosen not for its cost, but for its meaning. "I know we've been through enough. Drama to last a lifetime. I know we both came into this broken and scared and not looking for love. But Emily Ross, will you marry me? Will you let me love you and Jake for the rest of my life? Will you help me raise Emma and show her what real love looks like?" Emily's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of pure joy, pure gratitude, pure love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes to all of it. Yes to building a life together. Yes to being a family. Yes to whatever comes next as long as we face it together." As Luke slipped the ring onto her finger, Jake came running over from where he'd been showing Emma's friends his father's pocket watch. "Are you guys getting married?" he asked, his voice bright with excitement and hope. "We are," Emily laughed, pulling her son into a hug. Jake pumped his fist in the air with the enthusiasm that only children could muster for truly wonderful news. "Emma, Emma, they're getting married! We're really going to be a family!" Emma ran over, her face bright with excitement and something that looked like relief, like she'd been hoping for this moment but hadn't dared to believe it would actually happen. "Really? Really, really?" Luke pulled both children into a group hug, feeling his heart expand to accommodate love he'd never thought he'd be capable of again. "Really, really?" As the four of them sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars come out over their new life, Luke thought about the quote that had started this whole journey. "You haven't really lived until you've done something for someone who can never repay you." He had thought he was saving Emily and Jake, rescuing them from a desperate situation and giving them a chance at a better life. But the truth was, they had saved him. They had taught him that the best families aren't always the ones you're born into. Sometimes they're the ones you choose, the ones you fight for, the ones you build together from love and hope and second chances, and the courage to remain open to unexpected grace. And as Jake fell asleep against his shoulder and Emma curled up against Emily, their breathing settling into the rhythm of peace and safety and unconditional love, Luke Anderson finally understood what it meant to truly live. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of love, loss, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear that better days are coming. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of kindness, the importance of chosen family, and the miracle of love that comes when we're brave enough to open our hearts again. Remember, you never know whose life you might change just by choosing to care, just by stopping when everyone else drives by. What act of kindness will you do today?